Hey there YouTube and all my subscriber family. I want to talk a little bit about what I've been doing over the last couple of weeks. I've got my tea and I'm ready to talk. So as you know from my previous videos, I've been focusing quite a bit on getting the kitchen ready to go. And for the most part, it's fully functional, so long as the holding tank for my fresh water is not frozen. The faucet is running, and I need to find some sort of heating pad that will prevent, or at least slow down, the freezing process. But I don't think it's going to be too much of an issue, but we'll find out as time moves on. The stove and oven combo, which is from Camp Chef, is fully functional as well. All I have to do is attach the propane tank and it works great. So all I have to really do for the kitchen itself is work on that countertop template, which I have yet to do, as well as build that countertop. But that was, from previous videos, the kitchen assembly. And there will be more videos on that. But what I really want to talk about is what I've been doing over the last couple of weeks. And as you may know, perhaps not, but if you've watched some of my really early videos, in fact, if you've watched my very first video, which is still there and still available to see, you will find that when I first purchased this van, about a year and a half ago now, give or take, it had no passenger seat. And up until a couple of weeks ago, and actually, to be more accurate, until last week, I remained to have no passenger seat. Which meant that if I wanted to give someone a ride, they'd have to either sit on the bare floor or they'd have to sit in the back. And if I didn't know the person, naturally they're not going to sit in the back, so I was very limited. And having one passenger seat's it doesn't really open up that many opportunities, but nevertheless, I needed a passenger seat, because I do give people rides from time to time. So I now have a passenger seat, and so far I've been able to use it a couple of times, and as it stands right now, it's working out quite well. But I believe that I've mentioned in at least one previous video, and I could not tell you for the life of me which video that was unless I were to go back and watch them all. That I had planned on building a box for my batteries for the living quarters, and it would function for two reasons: one, to be able to house my batteries, but also to act as a passenger seat. Now, I could have easily just installed a passenger seat, gone to a junkyard or something like that, and purchased a passenger seat, but I decided to, do what would be the wise thing to do. Well, maybe it's the wise thing to do. Perhaps not. But I decided to have a dual purpose. So yeah, my passenger seat is also my battery bank. So my passenger seat / battery box will be able to house 4 batteries, which means that I can have a sum total of 488 amp hours. Of course, what that really means is I'll have 244 amp hours that I can use, because you don't want your deep cycle batteries to fall below 50%, because it can possibly drastically reduce the lifespan of the batteries. And right now I only have 2 batteries in my battery box. The one that I was referring to is not yet hooked up, and I need to still make a couple of cables to tie them in parallel. So to give you some rough dimensions of my battery box, which also seconds as a passenger seat. It is 12 inches high, and the reason why I made it 12 inches high is so that way, even with the battery handles, which you can push them down, but it reaches about 11.5 inches. So I wanted to make sure to have plenty of room to work inside that box if I ever needed to. So it's 12 inches high, it's 20 inches wide on the inside, and 22 inches long on the inside. And it's made out of 1/2-inch plywood, so the outer dimensions are actually 13 inches high by 21 inches wide and 22 inches long, or deep, however you want to say it. And even though the dimensions are not necessary for this video, I thought I'd give them anyway, just in case maybe one of you would want to build something similar to this, would at least have something to go by if you plan on using Walmart batteries yourselves, especially the ones that I use, which are 122 amp hour. But the way that I designed it actually kind of came out by accident at first, because my original intention was to build the box out, at least the sides and the bottom. I drilled 2 holes that were just wide enough to fit 6-gauge wire that will run from the battery isolator to the box itself. And I would have a lid, which is held by piano hinges, and a way to lock the lid shut. But I did not consider that I didn't have 12-inch wide 1/2-inch. Well, I had some, but I didn't have enough. But I had some that was 11.5 inches wide. And even though that wasn't sufficient for my original design, I decided, okay, I had to think about it. But I eventually came up with the idea that I can use that 11.5-inch and make it flush on the top for the front and the back, so that way I can feed cables underneath with that 1/2-inch open gap that resides at the bottom. So from the battery isolator, I can simply feed the cables in. I don't have to drill any holes. And the batteries are maintenance free, and so they're sealed. They don't give off any harsh chemicals. And then from the back, I can do the same thing. I can feed cables from the batteries to the living area. So having the 11.5-inch wide 1/2-inch plywood came to be quite the advantage. And completely unplanned, but that's one of the benefits of just thinking things through with what is available. So the piano hinges are mounted on the side of the box rather than on either the front or the back. And I may want to rethink that, because I've noticed the floor of the cabin is not exactly level, and I don't think it was ever intended to be. It just goes with the curvature of the van, and I get that. But one disadvantage to the way that the floor is being unlevel is when I try to open the lid of the box, it does scrape up against the partition wall here, the bulkhead. And that's not a big deal, because I'm eventually going to cover this with 1/8-inch foam backer for extra insulation, and it makes it look a little bit more construction-like, so it adds a little bit of stealth to it, rather than it looking custom like it does. Which I like the look of it, and I'll never really pay attention to it on this side. I like it more for the inside of the living space. But that being the challenge that it is, I am most likely going to move the piano hinges to either the back or the front of the box. And it's a minor issue, because how often am I actually going to open up the box? Right now what I have to do is actually lift the box ever so slightly, and it weighs about 120 pounds right now, which isn't too terribly heavy, but I have to lift it ever so slightly so I can open up the door without scratching the bulkhead. And that's going to get twice as heavy once I add 2 more batteries, so I'll probably take care of that sooner than later. But right now it's just not a high priority. Another thing that I did last week, if I remember correctly, is I upgraded the wires that were going from the battery isolator to the battery bank in the box here, and also from the negative side of the battery terminal for my starter battery to the batteries to the negative side of my house batteries. And I did that for two reasons. The first reason is because I simply wanted to have a lower gauge wire, because the stuff that I had was, first of all, it was aluminum, so there's a considerable amount of power loss compared to copper wire. And also, the lower gauge wire being thicker will allow more power to go through it, and less chances of it heating up over a long period of time on the road, and it's just safer. So I did that, and one of the things I had to do, the 4 gauge or the 6 gauge terminals that Lowe's had, and I could have ordered some on Amazon, but I just wanted to get them while I was at Lowe's. And they're expensive. They're like $6 for a pair, but it is what it is. And the issue, though, is the 6 gauge terminals that I got at Lowe's were too narrow to be able to fit the the battery terminals. And so what I had to do is I had to buy an extra drill bit, which I'll probably end up using later anyway. And I had to drill out the holes of those wire terminals, which proved to be a slight challenge. I had to actually build a small concoction to be able to hold the terminals, which are pre-attached, which are not pre-attached, but I attached them to the battery first. Then I would put it in this little concoction that I made to keep it from bending and flipping all over the place, because the first one I did, actually, the drill bit actually ended up ripping the terminal out of the battery. So I had to take a screwdriver, open up the battery terminal again to mount it back down. So I built that little contraption, not concoction, but contraption, and was able to, with a slight bit of struggle, not too much, but a slight bit of struggle, I was able to actually drill out those terminals just fine, which worked out great. And the other reason I had to replace those wires is because they were too short for where I wanted my batteries to be positioned in the passenger side of the cabin. They're actually drastically too short. I literally had to have a battery practically up against the area of the passenger side where your feet are supposed to go. And it was simply not convenient, and I had wires all over the place. And so if I had a passenger in the cabin area, there's that ever so slight chance of electrocution. I mean, the likelihood, very unlikely, but I just didn't like that. So that was another reason to just get it taken care of. So I'm glad that's all done. The wires I used before were 12 gauge, and they were aluminum, and they were too short. I was considering building a back for the box/passenger seat, but I've tested it out, and it really doesn't need it because the bulkhead can work as a back. But what I did to compensate for the solid slight discomfort is I just got a couple of $5 seat cushions at Walmart just to try it out. I'll probably get some nicer ones, but they work for the time being. A friend of mine actually suggested that I put a car seat on top of the battery box, but unfortunately that just wouldn't work because of how tall it already sits. I suppose with most people, which are not 6'2", it would be fine. But the way it is right now, my head practically rubs up against the top of the ceiling of the cabin area as it is when I'm sitting in the passenger seat. And I actually very much enjoy sitting in the passenger seat on my lunch breaks at work. We don't have a break room, so I just sit in my van and listen to the radio or read or do something or take a nap. I do that quite often. Take a nap during my lunch break. Jasmine tea is delicious, by the way. Great for stress, too. And not that I have a stressful life, but it just prevents stress. That's a weird side note. But in the meantime, I just wanted to share that update with you and whatever content that I was able to capture in the process of the build. And as always, I want to thank you for watching this video and for staying with me here. As it is a slow build, but it is a progressing build. So thank you for watching. Take care. Love others as you love yourself. And I'll see you next time.